James Edward Moore from Dublin. Like many of his countrymen, he liked to bet, and when he was well enough, he used to love going to the dog track. Nan would often tell people, "My husband has walked home fully spent up from every greyhound track in London. He always took his carpet slippers with him, just in case he had to sell his shoes for that one last bet that would change his luck." He took me racing with him once to West Ham dog track. I remember the place was packed with men wearing flat or trilby hats like Uncle Jim. The bookies stood in a line on their boxes, shouting the odds and waving their arms about. After we placed our bet, I held Jim's hand as he took me down to the track rail just before the race to view the dogs parading by. We were that close, I could see the ripple of the hard muscles on the hounds' haunches as they passed. "Which one's ours, Uncle Jim?" Jim pointed to a dog with a striped coat. "Number 6. I watched fascinated as the dogs were shuffled into the traps. Once all the dogs were caged up, the official cleared the track. All was quiet for a few seconds. Then the hare shot by on a rail, the traps flew open, and the dogs shot out racing in pursuit of their elusive quarry. As the hound sped past, I shouted at the top of my voice, 'Come on, number 6! Yes, come on, number 6! We won, Uncle Jim!" "Yes, we did, Robbie." I looked up at Uncle Jim, and I was surprised to see he didn't seem that bothered or concerned that our dog had come first. After the race, the dogs were jumping up, trying to grab the furry hare from the track official, who was holding it just out of the dog's reach. Well, it didn't seem fair to me, so I asked Uncle Jim, "Well, why can't the dogs have the rabbit, Uncle Jim? It's not real, Robbie." Well, I sort of knew that, but all the same, after running all that way, I thought the dog should have a chance to at least play with it. I know we had won the race, but I don't think the winnings were what you might call life-changing. And I realise now why Jim wasn't that bothered. True gamblers, they crave the adrenaline rush of the chase and chance, and it seems to have very little to do with the winning or the losing. Nan told me in the early days, when she was young, on the rare occasions, if Jim's luck was in, he'd hide any paper money inside the back of a large clock that sat on the mantelpiece. They were probably 10-shilling notes, or maybe a pound or two. I doubt very much the big white fivers of those days found their way anywhere near either of them. If Jim was on a winning streak, the cash would cause the clock to lose time, or even stop, and Nan would ferret out a little extra to supplement our housekeeping. I don't know whether Jim suspected his wife of helping herself to his hidden booty, but he did know she didn't approve of his gambling, which caused many an argument. So he couldn't really accuse her without incriminating himself, I suppose. My last and very sad memory of Uncle Jim was the day before he died. I'd eaten an apple that was earmarked for him. I expect I'd eaten mine, and being a greedy little sod, could not resist the one sitting alone on the sideboard in the fruit bowl. I remember him crying to Nanny, Eva, he's eaten my apple." Illness can render the best of us to infancy. The slightest thing that goes wrong within the shrunken world sickness has stranded us in takes on tremendous importance. The next morning, Nan called gently up the stairs, "Robbie! Robbie!" I appeared. I stood outside my bedroom door at the top of the landing. "Uncle Jim's become a pretty angel." I said, "I know." Well, Nan asked me, "How do you know, Robbie?" "When I'd taken his apple yesterday, Uncle Jim said I wouldn't care if he died tomorrow." I guess it was an odd remark for a young kid to make. I can't for one moment imagine I had any foreboding or instinct about Jim's passing. I do remember very clearly my response at being told he'd become a pretty angel, as I stood in my pyjamas at the top of the stairs. School days for me were very painful, in more ways than one. The main problem with school, I just could not relate to the teachers, and I think the feeling was mutual. My nan always said I was misunderstood. Well, maybe I'll go along with that. Well, school seemed a complete mystery to me. I knew I had to go there, but I couldn't see why. What was it all about? And for the most part, I hated it, and was very happy when aged 15 my school days came to an end. My first primary school was Cannon Barnet, named after the 19th century reformer. The school is in Gunthorpe Street. It's backing onto the top end of Commercial Street, and is still there today, educating the 3 to 11-year-olds. The main building is late Victorian, built of light-coloured brick that was common of most schools at the time. And apart from some modern-looking extensions, sort of tacked on, the main building looks very much as it did in the 1950s. As a schoolboy, the interior seemed a bleak place to me. Lots of bricks, lots of doors and stairways. Everything seemed to smell of some kind of disinfectant. Maybe carbolic soap to ensure it killed off all known germs that we kids brought in from the outside. Our playground was surrounded by some iron-meshed netting to ensure we couldn't go AWOL, and to keep intruders out, I suppose. The small classrooms were mixed, with the girl and boys sitting side by side. The teachers seemed very remote, trying to instill in us the rudiments of the 3 R's by rote. Now, I'd like to confirm that today the school apparently has a good reputation. But in the 1950s, approach to education for the kids of the working class poor was very different. I wasn't at Cannon Barnet for very long, and I'm sure the following had something to do with my short stint there. One lunch hour, as we pupils were sitting at our trestle tables waiting for our turn to be fed, I began to fool around with my cutlery. I pretended to cut the kid's wrist sitting opposite me with the blunt edge of my dinner knife. I wasn't using any pressure, just having a joke. Next thing I knew, I was hauled out of my seat by the head teacher, who then dragged me up, squealing up the stairs to his room. Once inside, he began to thrash me across my buttocks with a cane. He did not ask what I thought I was doing, or give me a chance to explain that I was only using the blunt side of the knife as a joke. In retrospect, I suppose, I think there must have been some deep-seated reason why he overreacted the way he did. Perhaps he needed to eke out his anger and frustration on someone on that day. Maybe it was a reaction to something he'd seen during the war, maybe, and sparked off an unpleasant memory. Or maybe it was just me he wanted to punish for just being me. Perhaps, who knows? Whatever, my antics with the knife, seemingly cutting away at another kid's wrist, fitted the bill. I was at the right time at the wrong place. Or the wrong place at the right time, whatever. There was certainly something about me he didn't like. Every time I passed him in the school hall or the playground, he'd sing a song at me. Putt, 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 putt. Taking the mick out of my surname, making the sound as if I was some old locomotive or something passing by. My mother, Olive, she wrote to us regularly in those early days. I always knew her letters by the stamps on the envelope. She often sent Nan a few dollar bills tucked in the letter to help out. I loved the look and feel of the dollar bills, as I did all things American. Like all kids, I loved the cinema. It was a rare treat, going to the pictures. Being a boy, of course, I loved the cowboys. The cowboy films were the best, which was talked about by us kids for months. Our heroes were Roy Rogers, riding his horse Trigger, and the fast-shooting Tom Mix, and the funny grey-bearded old guy Gabby Hayes with the squeaky voice. It was always understood that one day I might be going to America to live with my mother and her husband, who we called Uncle Ralph. Nan always read the letters out loud, and this time the letter said, Ralph has a new job on a turkey ranch. Now the word ranch conjured up an image of a cowboy on horseback, scattering turkeys on his way as he yahooed through the prairie range. Rankers were cowboys who chased Indians, weren't they? And when I went to live in America, Uncle Ralph would become my daddy. A few weeks after the news of my ranch hand stepdad, our form teacher informed us, Today, children, we're going to learn about the Wild West. Not the one you see in films about cowboys chasing Indians, but the real American history. You're ahead of me, aren't you, I can tell. Miss, my daddy is a cowboy. You little liar, get out of my class, stand outside and I'll deal with you later. Now, I suppose hearing a raggedy-arsed East End kid shout out that his dad was a cowboy might be stretching things a bit, but wouldn't you have thought she might just be a bit curious how I came to pipe up about having a cowboy pa? I rushed out the class, crying at the injustice. I didn't wait, but ran straight out the school and went home. If I hadn't, I might be sent to the headmaster, and I'd already discovered, by the evidence of my sore ass, he was not a good listener. I told my nan what had happened when she came in from work. The next day, she came to the school with me to confront the teacher. I was beside myself with fear and excitement. My nan is going to give Miss what for? Nan stopped the teacher as she was going into the classroom. Excuse me, my boy is not a liar. His daddy is a cowboy and works on a ranch in California, in America. It was a bit of an anticlimax because the teacher shrugged her shoulders and turned into the classroom. Not long after, I was transferred to another school, nearer to Nan's shop in Burslem Street. My next placement was the Harry Gosling Primary School in Fairclough Street. But sadly for me, things didn't really improve. Being poor, I had free school dinners. I loved me food, but Harry G's main course was yuck. It seemed nearly always every other meal consisting of tasteless heaps of mince and mashed spuds. One day when I tried to leave the mince, a teacher took it up upon herself to inform me, "You boy, you've been given a nourishing meal free of charge, and will eat it all, no dessert." I managed to shovel it down. If I had just left a tiny morsel, I'd be in danger of getting no afters, and like all kids, I had a very sweet tooth. Few of us could afford our own books and pens and stuff, so it was supplied by the school. I was what they used to call a slow starter. I know now I was more than a bit dyslexic. I didn't understand arithmetic, I still don't, and at that stage I could hardly read. Our classroom had a particular bookcase against the wall. With books we were allowed to choose to take home and return, like a mini library. I'd sometimes take a book home, and Nan would read through it with me. It was nice. I have a vivid memory of that time of tucking down in bed as we read a story together. One day, the teacher, seeing me taking a book, said, "You can't read, Putt. Put it back." "Well, my nanny reads them with me." But like all teachers I encountered, they've always got to be right, and listening to any reasoning from an insolent schoolboy would not be tolerated. So I left bookless. The logic of that teacher's insistence that I could not be allowed to take a book home until I had learnt to read still astounds me to this day. I moved from the following term to be in Mr. Brown's class, and Mr. Brown seemed a pleasant, avuncular, kindly man with a chubby face and a ready smile. But being me, I somehow managed to get the wrong side of him. This particular misdemeanour, as I recall, was nothing major, which made his reaction even worse. When I was not pulling faces or throwing a paper dart, which could have been the case when the teacher's back was turned, my crime was I was giggling and whispering something to the kid next to me, probably some funny, smutty joke. Before I knew what was happening, Mr. Brown rushed from behind his desk and, on reaching me, thwacked me hard across my arched back with the edge of a wooden ruler. The pain of the ruler's edge was one thing, but the shock, the humiliation of being punished by kindly Mr. Brown, well, that somehow made it worse. I also felt the punishment did not fit the crime. Once again, I believe in retrospect, the teacher was overreacting to what was a trivial misdemeanour. Maybe I got away with being naughty too many times in the past, or at that very moment he saw red. I know my nan did. It must have been the summertime again, because I was wearing a thin shirt and the sharp ruler's edge had drawn blood. By the time I got home, my shirt was partly stuck to my back, and taking it off was very painful. Nan, seeing the bloody stripe the teacher inflicted on her boy, the next day she took me right into the class to find Mr. Brown, who was at his desk. "How dare you hit my boy? With the edge of a ruler, like that, he was bleeding." The kindly Mr. Brown, he looked up from his desk with an ingratiating smile, charming both Nan and me. "Yes, Mrs. Moore, it was an accident. I didn't intend to hit Robert so hard for talking in class. Just a rap, really. But you know what boys are. He moved or wriggled up from his seat, and I caught him awkwardly." Mr. Brown's friendly manner and explanation seemed to placate Nan. They shook hands and she left for work. The morning bell hadn't rung yet, so I went out to join my chums in the playground, and the incident was never referred to again. My best friend was Moishe Sable. We were school chums, and he lived near Nan's shop. Moishe's dad drove a bus, and if Nan and I happened to be on the bus, the conductor gave us a free ride. One day, Moishe and me, and another boy, Michael Fuller, I think his name was taking turns pulling each other along the polished floor of the school hall. As it was my turn to be dragged along by the other two, I felt something sharp go into my back, and I knew it was a fairly big splinter, and I was scared that Nan would be cross if she saw it. It was bath night at home. I tried to insist that I keep my vest on, trying to convince Nan that I kept it on before, which of course I had not. Nan finally persuaded me that I did not bath with my vest on, not now or any other time, and yanked it off. Oh, my God! Nan took me to the A&E at the nearby London hospital, and they made it better. Opposite the school gate was a shop, and of course its location dictated that it sold an abundance of sweets and comics. The cheapest sweets you could buy were 4 lemon drops for a penny. The shopkeeper wouldn't sell you 2 for halfpence, or God forbid 1 for a farthing. I tried. No, it was the whole penny for 4, and no sale. The drops were tiny and pill-shaped, with a sharp hit of lemon, which I liked, and 4 for a penny was a good deal in my book. I think perhaps the shopkeeper had got his hands on a stash of vitamin C tablets, or the 1950s equivalent. One night I awoke with dreadful pains in my tummy. I was crying out, writhing on my bed. Back I went to the London hospital. The doctor gave me some medicine that gave me the copious farts, and each time I let rip, I could hear Nan utter, "Oh, that's better. Oh, that's good." No one had made a connection between my wind problem and the pills. Perhaps had nothing to do with it, but to this day, if I take any vitamin C tablets, the response to my system produces the same results. Yep, too much information, I know, but I think there might be some truth in my supposition. It was during a school playtime, and against the rules, I once again ran out of the school gate to cross the street, clutching a large brown penny in my hot little hand for my acidic hit of lemon tabs. I saw the van just before I went black. The next thing I remember, I was laying in the back of an ambulance with Nan looking down at me, wiping the blood out from under my woolly brown knitted balaclava helmet. I was back in the London hospital again, this time in a ward. Surprisingly, I'd suffered no real damage, only mild concussion, with a few scrapes and bruises. But having got concussion, I had to spend a few days in the hospital, just for observation, in case I had missed something. The next day, I was sitting up in bed, feeling my old self again, having just enjoyed a nice big lunch. I can see this man in a brown coat walking up the ward carrying a small parcel. But when he reached my bed, he stopped and smiled down at me. "Hello, do you remember me? Do you know who I am?" "No, mister." "You ran in front of my van." He handed me the parcel. "There you are, son. Now you watch where you're going in future when you cross the road." I was quite nonplussed. I couldn't quite grasp why this nice man, the one who had knocked me down, was giving me a present. When I looked up, he was walking away. I tore off the brown paper wrapping, and I opened this little box inside to find it contained a little plastic miniature roundabout with tiny animals on it, and by turning a key on the side it played a tune as the animals circled round. My Nan told me later that the man was a baker on his deliveries when we unexpectedly bumped into each other. Soon after my unfortunate encounter with the baker's van, the school had a wire mesh safety grille installed in front of the gate to stop us kids rushing out across the road without having to look, so I inadvertently did some good. In East London in the 1950s, like most major cities, as a result of the war, there's a lot of bomb sites and bombed-out houses. These ruins were much too tempting for us little boys to ignore, and so became our adventure playgrounds. Now, my friend Moishe and I had climbed up on top of a bombed-out shop, and were having fun sliding down the glass roof panels. I remember Moishe sliding down one pane with me behind. He stood up to go back for another go. I stood up, just after him, and with our combined weight it gave way. I remember thinking as I went through, that's it, I thought my time had come. For a short while I was unconscious. I came to on the shop floor. I saw Moisture was crying. His face was covered in blood. A shard of glass had pushed through under his chin and out the other side. Slowly we got to our feet and made our way out of the shop. Moisture, crying with his face covered in blood, ran home. I'd just made it to Nan's shop and collapsed on top of a pile of sacks full of washing. I came round again in the London hospital. My luck had held. I must have a guardian angel watching over me. My injuries were only a sprained ankle and a few bruises, and I was allowed to go home the next day, supported by crutches. I think they must have needed the beds. Moisture was also sent home, but his stitched-up jaw hadn't held and he had to be rushed back into hospital and had to stay overnight. I was quite jealous that they hadn't kept me in too. I did so like the attention of the doctors and nurses, being visited, having my food brought to me in bed on a tray. I might have been in danger of developing the early stages of Munchausen syndrome. I'd become such a regular at the London hospital by this time, and during one particular visit to the A&E department, perhaps to a follow-up appointment, a nurse, spotting me in the waiting area, called out cheerily, "Hello, Robert." My Nan often raised a chuckle telling her cronies that story. My poor Nan, what with a dying husband to nurse and me to raise, and as usual very little money to do it all with, it must have been, in fact, I'm sure it was, quite a struggle to keep body and soul together. But Nan, putting her trust in Providence or the Almighty, she never seemed to totally despair. When things were at rock bottom, she often would say, "Not to worry, Robbie, something will turn up." And mostly something would turn up to keep us afloat. A friendly grocer near to Nan's shop would pop in with a box of loose vegetables he had over at the end of the day. The butcher might have some scrag ends of meat going cheap. Somehow, Nan always managed to put food on the table. Now, this one time I had a heavy cold, which developed into pneumonia, and then double pneumonia. The doctor prescribed daily injections, which were carried out by a visiting nurse. The needles looked huge, and I'd struggle and scream as the nurse stuck them in my arse, or any soft tissue she could get hold of. Nan finally put a stop to that. "You're not going to stick those into my boy any more." The needles were replaced by some foul-tasting medicine which I spat out. I started to hallucinate, seeing spiders crawling over the bed covers, and Nan would hit them to where I pointed with a rolled-up newspaper. I saw my mother standing at my bedroom door with her arms open, and when I became very drowsy, the doctor apparently told Nan if he makes it through the night, he'll be all right. Of course I did, but I developed or contracted primary tuberculosis, a common illness those days. I seemed to be forever having to clear my throat, irritating the life out of everyone. The TB caused half of one of my lungs to collapse, and I had to be sent to a sanatorium for a while. The ward had many other kids with lung problems brought on by TB, and the disease had spread so far for some of the older children that it was too late for them to benefit from the new medicines, such as streptomycin. I spent 6 months in a sanatorium, or mainly eating my head off. Feed them up, I think, was part of the treatment. And in those impoverished days of meagre means, a variety of food wasn't always available or affordable. But in the sanatorium for sick children, food was plentiful. I'd never seen so much grub set before me on a plate. Those of us well enough went along to the dining room for our meals. Breakfast consisted of cereal or porridge if you wanted it, followed by fried eggs, 2 if you wanted it, which I think I always did, rashers of bacon, sausages, fried bread, and washed down with as many cups of sweet tea you could drink. If you asked for more, unlike Oliver Twist, you got it. A nurse asked me one time, "How many sausages have you eaten, Robert?" 9, I replied. The result of this 6-month gorging orgy was a normal-looking, skinny Just William-type kid left home to be replaced by Billy Bunter. Jim, being too ill to visit, hadn't seen me for 6 months, and when he did, he laughed. Good God, he's like a ball on legs. Well, fat or not, the treatment they gave me worked, and by my teens, my half-collapsed lung had grown back to normal size, and I was completely cured. Not long before Jim died, Nan had to stay at home to care for him, and could not work, and we had no money coming in, and she was really struggling to make ends meet. Nan had to swallow her pride and ask for help. In the early 1950s, the social services were called the public assistance. This was where the desperate had to almost beg for handouts, for the officials who seemed to treat the money like their own. Nan told me when I was old enough to understand that she really did plead her case, and finally received the princely sum of a one-off payment of 14 shillings. That's about 70p today. 70 pence. Our rent was half that, so pushing food on the table for the three of us didn't equate, and I think Nan often skipped a meal, saying she wasn't very hungry. By the time the money had arrived, Jim had passed away, and Nan took the 14 bob back to the public assistance office and threw it back at the man behind the counter, shouting, "It's too late now, you can have it back, he's dead." When I came out of the sanatorium, I was sent to what was called an open-air school. Those schools were for delicate children who weren't quite strong enough to attend a proper state school. Our classrooms were large with wooden chalet-like structures. They had large windows that let in plenty of light and could be opened wide in the summer for us kids to benefit from fresh air. The school dinners were plentiful and varied, and much more nutritious than the ordinary state school lunches, and you could, once again, always ask for more. I remember me and this other kid, we were only turned away when we went back for more fruit salad for about the 7th time. Every day we had a mid-afternoon nap on canvas camp beds. They were set up in the assembly dining chalet. In the summer, weather permitting, our camp beds were set outside in the playground. This was the only school where I was really happy. There was strict discipline, of course, but no one got the slipper or the cane, and those of us who lived some distance from school were picked up by a school bus at various collection stops near to where we lived. There was a bus attendant, a woman in her later years, who sat at the front near the driver to keep us safe and in line. One day, now I can't quite recall how this came about, but we were told that the bus was unable to pick us up for a while until they found a new attendant. I somehow picked up that Nan was in need of a job at the time, and I must have spoken up. Well, Nan got the job and became the school bus attendant. She was soon after that employed as a school mother, a kind of precursor of the teacher's assistant we have today. Nan had a loving way with children, and they loved her right back. I think a few of the kids were quite envious that she belonged to me. Occasionally, Nan would take a class if the teacher was delayed or away for the day. Nan impressed the school so much that they wanted her to take a teaching course. Unfortunately, Nan was aged 60 by then and thought too old to train. Eva would have made a wonderful teacher, and I believe she had found, but sadly too late, her true vocation. How I wish I'd paid more attention to Nan's past history, but like many youngsters, I was too into myself to take them in. But I do have a potted version of sorts of stuff I do remember. Eva Eliza Redford, my Nan. She was well educated. Her father believed and paid a few pence a week so his children had their own books and writing material. Nan was born in the seaside town of Cleethorpes, North Lincolnshire. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. One sister, Olive, whom my mother was named after, died aged 14. The family eventually moved to Hull. Her dad, my great-grandfather, had a barge with a large white horse to pull the barge along the canals. At 16, Nan still didn't know the facts of life. All she knew is when the doctor came to the house with this particular bag, a baby would be born. She told me when the doc asked her to fetch something from the bag one time, she put her hand in and began to squeal. When they asked why, she replied, "I've touched the baby's head." I think this very young, innocent 16-year-old girl, the doctor, was like a stork delivering the newborn. I believe after that she was taken to one side and better informed. Eva married Albert Putt, Olive's father, my grandfather. Albert was a merchant seaman, and one day, embarking from his ship, he fell over the side and was crushed to death between the ship and the dock. Nan told me that Albert saw his daughter when she was a little baby, but just the once before his fatal accident. Nan always spoke so lovingly of Albert. I think Olive was around 12 years old when Eva married Jim, and I don't think Olive got on well with her stepfather. After Nan's folks died, the whole family moved to London to look for work. Her 2 sisters and 1 brother moved into a council estate, Ramwell Close, in Bow, East London. Her elder brother joined the army and became a captain. The Close is where her flat was when, after the war, Nan, Jim, Olive and myself as a baby returned to. Nan had various jobs. I think she was a maid of all works for a doctor at a time, and she was a cook in various pubs. One pub was the 3 Greyhounds in Old Compton Street in Soho, which is still there, and I sometimes pop in for a pint and imagine her there serving up. Jim worked as a chauffeur, so in time-honoured fashion, the chauffeur and the cook got married. It was 1954. I was 10 years old. Jim had passed away. For some reason, Eva wanted to move from our flat in Broome House. I think she felt haunted by it in some way. She put in for a council transfer and took the first one that was offered. A day or so before we moved, Nan said to me quite earnestly, "Now, Robbie, now we're going to move to a place called Poplar, and you're not Jewish." And that was it. We were leaving Aldgate, and I was a little Goy kid, a Christian, a Gentile. I don't think I really took much notice of it. I wasn't really bothered. I mean, as a kid, you accept how things are. I think she was just making sure I wasn't confused about anything. Our few sticks of furniture were loaded up in a lorry with a canvas sheet over it, and we moved deeper into the East End to Poplar. Our new flat was near the docks, by the Blackwall Tunnel. The district was very different from Aldgate. It didn't seem to have much of an identity, not like the predominantly Jewish area we'd just moved from. Because of Nan's desperation to move, we found ourselves dumped in this slum of a council flat in Brunswick Road. The housing estate was made up of 3 blocks of flats, Melbourne, Adelaide and Sydney buildings. We moved in to Sydney, and our place was directly opposite Poplar Hospital, which, given my track record, would prove very useful. Why the blocks were named after cities in Australia, I never know. They were as far away from Bondi Beach as you could get. I believe they had already been condemned as unfit slums in the 1930s. But the war happened, and when bombing raids began, I expect all demolition and construction in London came to a stop, as it probably did in most cities. So, the 3 blocks were either left to decay or crumble, or maybe they hoped the Luftwaffe would save the council the expense by knocking them down. It was more than possible. I mean, they could get a direct hit because the docks were just a grenade throw away from the estate. Still, they had survived the war, and in the mid-1950s were still standing and thought fit for the poor to live in. Our tiny fetid flat had 1 bedroom, a stone-floor kitchen and 1 front room. The condensation was so bad that the ceiling paper kept falling away, no matter how many times we tried to stick it back. The council would decorate every year or so, pasting new wall and ceiling paper up, but within a few weeks it started drooping down again. At times it looked as if we were living under a Bedouin tent. Sometimes I have unsettling dreams about that flat. Nothing much happens in the dream apart from that I'm forced to go back there to live on my own. It freaks me out, and it's such a relief to wake up in my nice centrally heated house again. All the flats had coal-burning fires, with a black range and a side oven. The ovens weren't used for cooking any longer because we had proper freestanding cookers in the kitchen. The coal ovens were used to keep food hot and to warm crispy cold socks and underwear in the winter. The coalman had to carry his heavy bags up to all 4 landings, and if everyone was getting coal that day in the estate, it was 55 flats times 3. I don't suppose everybody had a whole bag of coal. Some probably shared, but still it's quite a slog. The bigger boys helped the coalman out by carrying the bags for a bit of extra pocket money. I wasn't quite strong enough to get involved, even though I was quite a coal aficionado back in Aldgate. My best chum in Sydney buildings was Stanley. Now Stan lived in a flat the same size of ours on the floor below. There was Stan, his younger sister, his mum and his crippled grandmother, who hobbled along on a built-up shoe on one foot because one leg was shorter than the other. There were 4 people living in cramped conditions in a flat the same size as ours. How they kept body and soul together in such cramped conditions I'll never know. By our teens, Stan and I had gone our separate ways and lost touch, but a few years ago he contacted me, tracking me down through the internet. We now meet up 2 or 3 times a year in Soho for a jar and a bite to eat. Here we are now, 2 old pensioners, remembering those not-so-happy days. Stan, however, has many good memories, though slightly through rose-tinted glasses, it's true, but he has given our boyhood a bit more colour. You could walk or cycle through Blackwall Tunnel in those days, and we often spent many a happy day walking over to Greenwich Park, climbing trees, collecting conkers, or lazing in the sun, eating our sandwiches. Bunking in the cinema without paying, that was another scam for us kids. Now, that was usually the Pavilion Picture House in East India Dock Road. You'd wait by the side exit of the cinema, that's the side door, and when someone came out, you'd slip in. Once inside the auditorium, the trick was to keep low, ducking down in the dark, then crawl along below a row of seats, then wriggle up into an empty one, feeling safely ensconced to enjoy the film. Sometimes we'd get caught by Ted, the attendant. He wore a uniform that had seen better days and a peaked cap. He was very tall, and of course he was known to us kids as Lanky Ted. When Ted suspected we were hanging about outside trying to bunk in, he'd wait just inside the exit door. The moment a little head poked through, down would come Ted's torch. "Oh, go on, get out, you big black, go on, fuck off." We never stopped trying to bunk in, though, and I think it was about 4 to 1 in our favour, so it was always worth a shot. The best picture outings were on a Saturday morning, when we kids could go to the cinema for a full programme for 6p. You could see a short educational film, quite often it's about how you cut bread properly or something, a cartoon, followed by the main feature, usually a cowboy, or my other favourite, a Norman Wisdom film. Sometimes there'd be a dancer or a juggling act or someone playing a musical instrument on the stage live. I mean, that's during the interval. We really did get our money's worth. Years later, I found out that Stan had a lot of scams going on that I didn't know anything about. I'll say he was probably the prince of scammers. He'd wait outside the dock gates to get sandwiches for the docker in a nearby cafe. The dockers weren't trusted to leave because goods from the ship's cargo might go missing. Stan knew where to find tar blocks, tar-infused blocks of wood that were used in roadworks. That could be a substitute for coal. He had a regular stallholder he used to help down Chris Street Market. He helped the milkman out on his rounds, and he mucked out the coalman's stable, and he might have collected all shit for manure. Stan was playing his cards very close to his chest, and I only found out about his super scamming recently, now that we're both old men, the crafty sod. Stan, like all kids, loved my nan. Eva was a good cook, and could create a meal out of a scrag end of meat, a few spuds and an onion. She'd make such scrumptious delights as bread pudding, her speciality. Her bread pudding has never tasted the same twice. Sometimes it came out the oven nestling on a baking tray, all fruity and moist. Another time all crusty and slightly dry. Whatever, Nan's bread pudding was the stuff of legend, and I have rarely tasted anything like it since. I'm sure Stan was able to smell Nan's baking from his landing below, because suddenly he'd appear at our door, wondering if I was coming out to play. It was only fair, because Stan knew where the wild rhubarb grew, a waste ground near a railway bridge, a secret he did share with me. Nan would bake a lovely rhubarb tart. I can see the hot succulent juices seeping out of the pie onto the thick hot custard to this day. I'd spoon it up, blowing all the time, trying not to burn my mouth. Stan stayed living in the East End and was employed most of his working life by the local council. He began as a tea boy and ended up as head storekeeper, a job I think suited him very well. Stan told me his nickname at the council was the Ferret, because he could ferret out anything that was asked for. Stan has a wife, a grown family with grandchildren now. He owns his own home. He bought a chalet on the coast for weekends when the kids were younger. These days, the family jointly have an apartment in Spain for holidays. Not too shabby for a boy born and raised in the slums of East London and working for the council. I was past physically fit, and I had to leave my easy-going open-air school and was enrolled in the nearest junior school, Culloden Street. My education had been spasmodic. Being in hospital with TB for months at a time and moving to different schools kept me back. And I'm sure you've gathered by now I was in any way the ideal pupil. But the consequences of my peripatetic schooling meant I was always behind the rest of the class. Changing schools too often during those formative years is not a good thing for any kid, especially one like me, always being a slow starter. A slow starter. I hardly got off the blocks. Blighty was still recovering from the Second World War, and due to the lack of manpower, I believe, and it's only my opinion, Poplar must have been given the dregs of what passed for teachers. These brutalised men, probably unable to get work elsewhere, with half a decent education, were available as teachers. They were, I am sure, those who saw teaching as a vocation, but from my experience, few came to Poplar. I'm sure many of them found themselves teaching in the East End, had lived, fought, and somehow survived the madness of the 1939-45 years. Men, disciplinarians, who had been either in the armed forces or did some kind of war work. For the most part, I think they believed the road to good education was to put the fear of God into the children in their care. The 2 years I spent at Culloden Street School were the worst times of my young life, and it left a mark on me for years to come. Corporate punishment was standard practice and rife in the 1950s, and was taken full advantage of by some of the men I had the ill fortune to get the wrong side of. It was always spare the rod and spoil the child. The weapon of choice at Culloden Street was the cane, a bamboo rod of various thicknesses. I seemed always to be either having a punishment pending or recovering from a recent thrashing. And I didn't help myself by always trying to be the classroom clown. I'd fall around like throwing a ball of paper at someone, making farting noises behind the teacher's back, anything to get a laugh. Obviously I was a born entertainer. I'd get caught running through the assembly hall, scrapping in the playground. Nothing really serious, just naughty boy stuff. The teachers were bad enough, but you had to be ever alert and watch out for the school prefects lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting to catch a kid breaking the rules. I'd get caught being late for school and running up the stairs 2 at a time. All crimes, if caught, must be reported. I'd get to the top of the last landing and out would slither, this clean-cut, smart-ass, skinny toad of a kid sporting his shiny prefect badge on his label of his new-looking jacket. I mean, we didn't have school uniforms in those days, but somehow these little neo-Nazis made their clothes look very uniform, and standing in front of me like a soldier on camp duty. "Putt, I'm going to put you on report for jumping up the stairs, running in the hall, having a water fight in the boys' lavatory." And down would come the cane during the next break by the teacher on thwacking duty. One teacher, who was very sporty, seemed to collude with his boss, the headmaster. It was definitely a conspiracy that they were out to get me. These men were my main nemesis at Culloden Street. These bastards made certain that either my hands were constantly swollen, in particular my thumbs, or my buttocks were red raw. Why these bullies focused on me I don't really know. I'm sure they had me marked down as a wrong. Being a fat kid then, I'd showed little aptitude for the track or field. I showed little interest in football or cricket, which was probably enough of a sin for the sports teachers to pick on me. My size didn't help because I was easily spotted in an unruly ruckus or a jape in the playground and classrooms. I think my form teacher was also in on it too, and was told to keep an eye on Putt. He often happened to look up just when I was talking, or taking part in some clowning around with the other kids, and instead of dealing me like he did with the other kids in the class, he'd send me to the headmaster. One lesson, we were to write a competition and told to make sure you fill the pages upright. I decided to fill my pages by writing 3 words to a line. This did not go down very well, and Putt was sent to the headmaster's office. Once again, this head bastard took so much pleasure in punishing me, either by giving me the cane or humiliating me in any way he could. I can still hear him now as he stood over me, lining me up. Yes, Putt, you can flinch. You can flinch, Putt, you're a coward. And with a little jump, swish, the cane would whip down through the air onto my open palm. Come on, hold it out. Thwack! Yes, Putt, again. 3 lengths on each palm for using 3 words a line. I thought then, as I still do now, that getting 6 of the best was a tad excessive, but I'm sure he enjoyed himself. Every morning we had assembly, and a pupil would be given a text to read out from the prayer book in front of the whole school. The head would stand close by the boy or girl, ready to prompt him or her if they happened to stumble over a word. The morning dawned for me to give the reading, and I was a bit unsure about a couple of words in my text. Nervously holding the holy book, I walked to the front of the school and took my place next to my nemesis. Just before I began to read, the head took a purposeful step back, standing about 3 feet behind me. I began to read and came to a stop, unsure of a particular word. I looked back at the head, hoping he'd come to my aid. He craned over towards me and said loudly, What is it, Putt? I lifted the book with my finger under the word. He walked slowly forward and, looking down at the text, read it out for all to hear before returning to his place 3 feet behind me. My public humiliation probably gave him a hard-on for the rest of the day. I know it may seem I'm being a bit paranoid, and maybe it wasn't all bad, but those events are etched on my memory as clear as yesterday. It was time to take the 11+, which I hadn't a chance in hell of passing, and the hated sports teacher was our test master. I was nervous enough, and I'm sure he knew it, but just in case I fluked to pass, he came up behind me. He leaned over and growled quietly in my ear, You're lucky you're not in my class, aren't you, Putt? Yes, sir. It so did the trick. I even messed up the front page of the exam paper. I wrote my name and address in the wrong section, but I crossed it out, and I thought I could improve matters by making an inky squared-off design all over it, in an attempt to make it look less untidy. The exam did not get any easier, and of course I failed with flying colours.